All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Sahara, and I am a student who serves on the CSUN Act Now committee, a committee dedicated to informing students on this upcoming election and hosting big politics events with our local leadership. Today, I'd like to give a warm welcome to LA Mayor Eric Garcetti. Mayor Garcetti has served Vice President Biden as a campaign national co-chair, as well as sitting on the Running Mate Selection Committee, leading the Democratic nomination of California's own Senator Kamala Harris for the vice presidency. Garcetti was elected 4 times by his peers to serve as the city council president, and his council district was nationally noted for its revitalization during his tenure. He earned his BA and MA from Columbia University and studied as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and the London School of Economics. He has also served as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Mayor Garcetti, thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be with Sahara and be with all of you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I know I'd rather be with you in person, but I'll take 2 dimensions, especially through Zoom. So really great to be with you. Do you want me to say a few things, just open up and then go to Q&A?
Yeah, so I'm thinking you can begin and tell us a little bit about your background and your journey to becoming mayor.
Absolutely. So I'm a Valley boy, born and bred the first 18 years of my life in Encino. My grandmother lived in Sherman Oaks. My Mexican grandparents lived in Van Nuys. I'm half Mexican, half Jewish with an Italian last name, only in LA. But really, I think my story starts with those immigrants that came here. Both sides of my family fleeing war, refugees on one hand, Jews in the Russian Empire who were experiencing pogroms and killings and conscription in the army. So they fled to first the Midwest and then very quickly came to LA. On my father's side, my grandfather was a dreamer before we had that term. He was born in Mexico to 2 parents, but the father, my great-grandfather, was killed in the Mexican Revolution, and my bisabuela, my great-grandmother, carried him over the border in her arms. And I think about that a lot these days when children are separated from their parents over the last few years, that I probably wouldn't have been here if that had been the policy, but luckily came here, married my grandmother, who was a second-generation Mexican-American, one of 18 children who grew up in Arizona and then LA. My father grew up in South LA. My grandparents were all from East LA. I grew up in the Valley. My parents now live in West LA. So I've kind of been on all 4 corners of Los Angeles. But I'd say growing up as a Valley boy, like you, I was a student activist. You know, in high school, I started volunteering on Skid Row to treat people when environmentalism was kind of something new. And then I went to college in New York City. I wanted to see the other big city and was in Harlem in the height of the crack epidemic and a time when there was a lot of homelessness, there was a lot of drug abuse and mental health issues. And I kind of cut my teeth working on racial justice, on international human rights. And because growing up in LA, it's such an international place, I thought I'd go into international relations. I majored in political science and did a master's in international relations, studied in England and lived in the summers in Burma, where I worked with the democratic resistance in the jungles of Burma who were fighting a civil war against an oppressive government. I lived in Africa, where I worked with women's groups to end the practice of female genital excision, this kind of barbaric practice that we were able to help eliminate in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and looked at the development of those countries, and then came home figuring, you know, I'd be a teacher, and I was teaching at USC and at Occidental College. And then suddenly somebody said, hey, Eric, I was living in Silver Lake at the time, we need somebody good to run for city council. And I was 29, thought, hey, I know I won't win, but why don't I bring a young voice to the race? And I just talked to more people, walked and knocked on more doors. And suddenly I was a city council member, and that was 19 years ago. So I've been at City Hall 12 years as a city council member, including leading the council. And now almost 8 years, about 7 years plus as your mayor. And it has been the most rewarding thing. I think a lot of people do national work and international work, when to me, all this always comes down to where we actually live, the block that we're on. What does climate change mean, but a hot block that you're on as a student or a senior in the San Fernando Valley trying to survive a record hot day? What is anti-poverty work, but the person living in a tent down the street? What is racial justice or gender equity mean, but the experience that you have in your family, in your city? So I would always encourage people when they come to me for advice about working at things at the national level, and certainly there's a very important election at the national level, the most important election of our lives, always stay rooted to something local. And I've never stopped being an activist. I've never stopped being somebody who really views myself as having a title now, but long after I'm a mayor, I'm going to be an Angelino and an activist till the last days that I have. And to me, that's a life well lived, one that's well worth it. And just excited to be with you guys. By the way, one side note, my second State of the City address was at the Soraya. I wish I was there with you guys, but it was the first time CSUN had ever had a State of the City address on the campus. And we've done so many amazing things together, from electric vehicles to expanding Black and Latino BIPOC folks that are working in tech and in the entertainment industry. We've worked on a lot of environmental work, on expanding democracy at the grassroots level, and transportation as well, to get built out a valley that has a good public transportation system. So I hope we can talk about those things in this year. And the last thing I'll say in my opening is just, I know what a tough year this has been, learning remotely, being away from each other. We've all suffered. We know people, and some in our families, that we've lost because of COVID. So look out after your mental and your spiritual health. Self-care is so important, especially at a moment when everybody is just yelling at each other and upset with one another. It's really important for us to rehumanize each other and to find ourselves, our own heart, to love ourselves, and then to love those around us, even those who might be somewhat different from us or have a different perspective. That will see us through. And I know that LA is ready to rise again. So I'll toss it back to you, and let's get into some of the discussion, the back and forth.
Of course. I first want to say, wow, what a story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And yes, I think being involved in local politics, it really does affect us on such a huge level. So thank you so much for addressing that as well. And I'm super excited to hear what you have to say.
Great.
So we'll start off with just kind of a question about your experience as mayor. What is your job like on a daily basis as mayor? And what would you say is the most challenging part of working within local government?
Well, I would say, look, the most expected thing in a day as mayor is the unexpected. There are so many things I set out to do as mayor. Everything from building out our public transportation system and redoing the airport, looking at gender equity and raising the minimum wage, making community college free, all these things that luckily bring the Olympics, things I've been able to do, hugely difficult, ambitious things. But I think we're often, what we forget about is it's not just the things we want to do and how well we do them, but it's the things we don't expect to happen and how well we respond to them. A pandemic, an economic downturn, the rise in homelessness, those things that really define our work, where there's not always necessarily a set end to it. But for me, being mayor is a couple things. Emotionally, it's about the highs and the lows of the city. It's sharing the triumphs. You know, people look to me when the Lakers win, and hopefully the Dodgers do too. But they also turn to me in moments of tragedy, when there's a shooting, a police officer is killed, or a young person is killed at the hands of a police officer, or we see, the tragedy of COVID-19, and I had to address the city every night for, I don't know how many nights in a row we did it, but I think it was like 40 or 50 nights. That is the job, to tell the story of Los Angeles, to say who we are, to try to bring together these opinions and to recognize it's not really about me, it's about a conversation Angelinos don't have with each other. And then lastly, it's to be ambitious. It's about to do things that you'll never get credit for, and I don't care about the credit, to do things that you're going to hand the baton to your successor, just as I took the baton from my predecessor, and to work on those things like passing Measure M, which was my biggest priority for my first term. That was the transportation measure. It's the largest, not just in LA history, it's the largest in US history, ×2, 15 rapid transit lines in a single city. But those will take 30 years to build. Some will be open the next couple of years, some will be open 5 years, 10 years. But we're in a culture where people say, deliver something that you can show right now. And we're not in a culture where people think about the long term, which is why things like homelessness and not enough housing have festered for so long, why we never had public transportation to the airport, why traffic and air pollution has continued. So much of what I try to do as mayor, what it's like to be as mayor, is to respond to the moment and then think about the 50 years from now perspective, and to somehow modulate that while you're dealing with people's triumphs and tragedies.
And you make it look so easy.
I know, but thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. One question that I know a lot of students are interested in and has had a lot of input about is, in light of recent events surrounding police brutality, there has been an ongoing conversation regarding how to address this issue. One proposed solution has been rebudgeting money from police services or defunding the police, as some have said. Do you think there should be a certain amount of money rebudgeted from police services to other services, such as mental health initiatives? for situations that police aren't necessarily equipped to handle, such as a mental health crisis?
I do, and we are. And it's not something that started this year just with looking at the calls for racial justice on the streets. I'm going to say a couple things, and I'm sure some of them will make some people who are at some ends of this conversation uncomfortable. First is that I think police officers are incredible people who put their lives on the line for us. I've been for 19 years with cops who will go on their off hours unpaid to help clean up an alleyway. I've grieved with parents who have lost their child to a shooting, including just a year ago, the son of immigrants, Officer Diaz, who was on his off time telling somebody not to tag a wall in the neighborhood he grew up in, and somebody shot and killed him. I think we have to remember there's human beings behind our badges. Secondly, though, we have no place for racism, institutional racism, not just in policing, but in any of the systems that I'm in charge of. That can exist in a fire department, and it can exist in our banking system, and certainly exists in our educational system. And we need to have that conversation without people feeling personally under attack. Anybody who breaks the law or breaks policy needs to pay the price, whether it's a mayor, whether it's a police officer, whether it's an everyday citizen, that should be applied equally. But what we have to do is find some common ground again. And I think Los Angeles is further ahead in this conversation than most of America, though it's tough because I know in moments when we see the trauma of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery's and everybody, the deaths that are just so traumatizing to us to watch and to say, really in 2020 in this country, we want to just cry out only with the rage when the rage needs to be followed by a conversation that brings people together at the table. We aren't a better city than other cities, but when I was your age, we had the beating of Rodney King. Long before there were cell phones and people could record this, somebody had a video camera and he didn't even lose his life, but we saw a black man beaten by a score of officers. And it set this town literally ablaze. 60-something people lost their lives in the riots that ensued when a not guilty verdict was put forward. But it led to a journey of taking a department that needed so much change forward. I would describe us as somewhere maybe midway in the mountain. We've come way up from the base, and to not see that is to deny the hard work of reformers inside the police department, families who lost their loved ones to the hands of police brutality, civil rights activists and others who really did push the department to go to a different place. Anybody who thinks that we're at the mountaintop, though, is naive and not looking up at how far we still have to go. But I'll give you some stats. We've been plugging away at ways that we could be the first place to have body cameras on our officers, to do de-escalation training so that maybe things didn't escalate to the loss of life, implicit bias training, which is where we learn about our own prejudice, and many other things. And we've reduced fatalities at the hands of LAPD officers by almost 48% in the last 4 years and another 30-something% this year alone. We're now, I think, 95th out of 100 in per capita deaths. And I want us to get to zero wherever possible, but policing can be obviously sometimes difficult work. You have somebody stabbing his wife and coming at you. There's going to be officer-involved fatal shootings. But if we can minimize that to being only in the most critically necessary cases, that's a step forward. We're the first big city also to do 8 can't wait, which are 8 things you can do to reduce fatalities at the hands of police officers by 70+%. There's probably about 15 things I could describe to you this year alone that we are implementing or implemented. And it might come as a shock and a surprise to a lot of people who are saying, well, wait a second, like I just hear LA is the deadliest city in America and police all suck and this, that, and the other. Like I said, no person of color should be dehumanized at the hands of a police officer or by any racism. Also, though, we shouldn't dehumanize who the people are who we're going to depend on. And I don't use the term defund the police because for me, a grammatically honest reading of defund means to zero out. When I've defunded programs as a mayor, that means I've gotten rid of them. I don't believe that we're going to, and I don't believe that we should get rid of the police department. But to get to your original question, we started a few years ago, for instance, looking at where can we apply civilians where police were doing all the work against gang violence. So we hired former gang members, youth interventionists, psychologists, social workers, and we stood up a program called Gang Reduction Youth Development, GRYD, GRID. And that's grown by much more as a percentage of the budget in my time as mayor than our police department has, for instance. And we saw where we put gang workers together with police officers and we built some trust between them and the community. It transformed all of their work and reduced crime by 40% more than just police officers working on their own. Similarly, I think for mental health calls, and we're going to be making an announcement in the next couple of weeks on this, we need a 24/7 response to mental health that isn't just a police officer. I don't just blame the police officers when there's nobody else to call at 2 a.m. because we've not ever done that. And while it's the county that's responsible for mental health, we approach the county saying, could we use our 911 systems? Could we do referrals where maybe we put some funding in, but where we have trained clinicians who can deal with somebody who is experiencing a mental health crisis and not have a badge and a police officer show up as long as there's no imminent danger. And I think that will be a relief to our police officers, and that we should shift some of those funds so that we don't just put that into a police budget, but we put that into a place that will have more of a long-term impact and output. So I could speak a long time on this because it's near and dear to my heart, but we're leading in the country on that. I know there's some who want to abolish the police or defund it. I don't share that perspective, but I also don't think that the status quo, even if we've made great progress, is enough. And we're going to see some things that I think will be helpful to policing, be helpful to public safety, and that will, and this is the term I've been using, help us all co-own public safety, not just contract it out to a police department.
Definitely. Thank you so much for touching on that. That was very informative. A follow-up question to that is, how do you propose we address institutional and systemic racism, specifically in leadership positions or education?
So I think a lot of it first comes down to funding. I'm a big supporter of reparations when it comes to the systemic racism that Black Americans have experienced as a result of slavery. I think we've done some form of reparations, but not enough to our first sin, which is to our Native Americans who were the first recipients of kind of systemic racism. And of course, then slavery was the second, and the Jim Crow and post Jim Crow racism of this country. I think when it comes to education, we have to start with funding. I hope folks will vote yes on Proposition 15, which would increase funding in schools at the state level, because we're still near the bottom of the pack in per pupil spending. I helped resolve the teachers' strike a year and a half ago because I was a big believer that we should be putting more investments into hiring nurses and counselors. We've got public schools that are more segregated today than in the 50s. They're not legally segregated anymore, but they're de facto segregated. They're all Latino and or African-American students in huge swaths of our city with no white and or Asian Pacific Islander students in those schools. Now there's some that are in the Valley, there's some that are kind of a mix, but for the most part, it's more segregated than before. And if you can afford it, and that's disproportionately, get this statistic, in Los Angeles, the wealth of your household, if you're white, is 80 to 90 times higher than if you're Mexican-American or Black. Now, nationally, it's 10 times. Here, it's 80 to 90 times. So if we don't begin to look at how redlining kept soldiers who were returning home from war who were Black or Mexican or Japanese from being able to buy housing, if we don't look at the assistance that wasn't there, how the schools have been separate and unequal, these things have a cumulative effect. So one of the things I'm looking at is supporting the national conversation on reparations. And I also am a big believer in a guaranteed basic income. Andrew Yang wrote on this, and we're going to look at doing a pilot here in Los Angeles where you guarantee essentially, maybe $1,000 or $500 a month to families that are locked in poverty. Let them make the decisions of where they can spend that on. When they then have $500 where they can spend on childcare so they can go to that job interview for a higher paying job or finish those course credits to get that degree, we begin to dismantle systemic racism. So that's the structural material piece. The second is in our own attitudes. And for everybody who rails against systemic racism, you're right, but I'd also say hold the mirror up to yourself. It's really easy to find those who are even worse than you, but the question is, what will we give up and where do our prejudices lie? When I was in college, I led National Student Coalition Against Harassment, a group that was of college campuses around the country dealing with racial and sexual orientation and sexual harassment. And basically, through that, part of the work we all had to do was, even though we thought we were the most progressive out there, we had to look inside ourselves and see what prejudices we all hold involuntarily, as well as sometimes voluntarily when it's worse, and really do that work of what will we give up? Who will we promote? What will we do? For instance, in my own office, I eliminated the gender pay gap in looking at equity. So now women in my office are paid equal or a little bit more than men. I looked at the makeup of our commissions to make sure, and we have double the African-American representation of the city on our city commissions because it was important to bring a generation of leaders forward. So what will you give up? What will you do? And what will you confront in your own personal attitudes and actions, as well as the material ones that we look at? I think those two routes are the best way to make sure this is, and it's not going to change overnight. This is a lifelong struggle. And that's frustrating, I know, for probably a young person to hear, but it started before I was born and before you were born, and it's going to continue after we die. But let's move that forward as aggressively as we can, as far down the playing field as we can.
Definitely. And I think it's really important to start and look within ourselves when wanting to implement change. So thank you so much for touching on that as well. Another question I want to ask is, after Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, you actually rallied together over 400 mayors to enact portions of the agreement into your own respective communities, which is amazing. What policies have you adopted in Los Angeles to combat the climate crisis, and what are your views on the climate crisis?
So I'm devoting my life to this. I think this is the fight of our lives, and certainly the fight of your lives as young people. This decade is the make or break decade. I've called it the climate decade. It has to be a decade of action. It's too late to reverse what human beings have done to our climate, but it's not too late to mitigate it. So I have a couple leadership hats that I wear, and then I'll talk about local. I founded Climate Mayors, which is the national group of American mayors. I've now recruited over 425 mayors in 48 states. It started before Trump said he was going to withdraw from Paris, but it accelerated after. And we said, if he's out, we're in. So every one of those cities run by Democrats, independent mayors, and Republican mayors have all pledged to adhere to the Paris Climate Accords and to implement that at the local level. And we're giving technical assistance to how people can electrify vehicles, weatherize and electrify their buildings, make sure the electricity that's being generated and consumed in their cities is from sustainable sources, et cetera. At the international level, as I mentioned, I chair something called C40 cities. These are the 100 biggest cities of the world and the mayors of them. So it's actually 97 right now. And our 97 cities comprise a quarter of the world's gross domestic product. And we are the ones leading our countries. Sometimes they have good governments who are working with them. Sometimes, like we have a bad government that's hostile to the work that we're doing, but we're still pushing for international work because we know what happens in Mozambique affects California and vice versa. To make specific plans and pledges, they're called Deadline 2020, of the actionable items we will take to be able to make sure that we're carbon neutral. So that takes me down to local level. Here in LA, we've put this into what I've called the LA's Green New Deal. I know there's a lot of controversy about Green New Deal at the national level. At the international level, it actually first came out of Europe and they're talking a lot about it. But I said, we know what it is here in Los Angeles. It's about the environment, it's about equity, and it's about the economy. So we have over 100 action items with 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year deadlines. I encourage you to go look at it. It used to be at plan.lacity.org, but you can Google LA Green New Deal and you'll find it. And it has the 5 zeros: zero carbon transportation, zero carbon buildings, zero carbon power, zero wasted water, and zero waste. So recycle 100%, waste no water, and then have zero carbon from the 3 main sectors: electricity, transportation, and buildings. Some of the bold things we've done, I said we're going to shut down our natural gas plants that are on the coast that you get your electricity from right now. A lot of pushback on that, but we have got to get away from fossil fuel generated electricity. In fact, I got the largest solar production and battery storage project in American history greenlit instead, and it's cheaper than building a natural gas plant, obviously less polluting. And we're looking at a whole range of things to get to carbon neutral. We're going to make 100% of our buses electric by 2030, maybe even 2028 by the time the Olympics and Paralympics arrive. Build 15 new rail lines as part of Measure M that I mentioned before. We're going to recycle 100% of our water. To give you an idea of how ambitious that is, the water that you see come down the pass that Mulholland built in the North Valley, this is something 3 times more water by just simply recycling the water. It comes through all of our drains to just south of the airport at the Hyperion treatment plant. We clean it almost to a drinkable standard and then wash it out to the ocean. Well, that's the last place that needs more water right now, and we're experiencing drought year over year. So 3 times the amount of water that we get out of the LA aqueduct, we are now going to recycle. And we're investing that money irreversibly in doing that. So there's a whole host of things in there, but to me, this is the fight of our lives. It is the only thing that matters. Will life still be able to sustain on this earth? And then second, what's the economy that supports that? So we have an emphasis on communities of color, frontline communities who experience the asthma, the cancer, the oil wells, the other things right in their backyard, and making sure that we put the investments there first and the jobs come out of there as well.
Wow, that's amazing. And I would also say that the climate crisis is a huge issue and one that's not partisan whatsoever. So I'm really glad that this is a main focus of yours, and the history of your work has shown that this is something you're passionate about. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to touch on, the homelessness epidemic in California. So, as you are aware, the homelessness epidemic is worse in California than any other state in the United States. And it is not getting too much better from what I have seen and others have seen. So I'm wondering, what are you doing as mayor to address the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles, or what do you think should be done?
I always never am sure whether I should start local or national. Let me start national for a moment, because the more I work on this issue, and I told you I started when I was 14 years old, everybody told me to avoid this issue at City Hall when I became mayor, because the city of Los Angeles has almost none of the causes into homelessness or the cures out. I think it's a common misunderstanding, but homelessness is mostly caused by trauma meets high rent. We have some control over the rent, which I'll get to in a minute. But the trauma pieces, which is the main driver right now, what we see at least on the street and encampments and people who are facing addiction and mental health untreated, mental health is a county responsibility. The jails are county, the prisons are state. Veterans coming home from war, that's something that's federal. You look at women who've experienced sexual and domestic violence, the treatment for that, for substance abuse, those are both county responsibilities. In other words, most of the things that are the programs or funding for helping people stop being homeless really aren't in city hands. But I didn't care. I'm the kind of leader who said, I'm going to take this on. I actually said, I will take responsibility for the response to homelessness, because somebody had to. And I worked very closely with county supervisors, Mark Ridley Thomas, for instance, who now is running for city council, to return to city council, where we both used to serve together, to pass two measures: to build more housing for people who are the worst off, and to put a quarter-cent sales tax for services to get outreach teams and mental health workers and all of that. That's just come online the last couple of years, and this will take, I believe, at least a decade to solve. But I increasingly believe, because I'll give you two statistics. 5 years ago, as we started to pull together every last dollar I could find, push the governor, then Brown, and now Newsom, who's been a great supporter of this, to get state money into the homeless fight throughout California. Push this administration, who, I'll work with anybody, even though I'm co-chair of Joe Biden's campaign, but that doesn't mean I won't work with an administration on something like homeless veterans, whatever, to get federal money. We went from housing about 10,000 people a year in Los Angeles in 3 years to housing over 25,000 a year. Now, with 60, at the time, 50,000 people homeless, I would have told you in 2 or 3 years, we're going to be done with homelessness. And yet, besides 1 year in the last 3, it's gone up. What that says is it's the supply in, not the policies once people are homeless, that we've got to do something about. Somebody once said, Eric, you're like the guy at the Rose Parade behind the horses, scooping up all the poop. You're not feeding the horses, you're not causing it, but everybody said, why is that on the ground? And I'll take whatever job. I'm a humble guy. I'll scoop the poop. I'll do whatever it takes. And certainly part of this work is engaging with a lot of people. And I'm very proud, 25,000 real human beings' lives were transformed last year off of the streets. But if the net for all of us is, oh my God, look at the encampments are growing. I see people go in the bathroom on the street. I see people, totally cycling out psychologically or self-treating their untreated mental health with drugs. We can't count that as a victory. So that brings me to where I said I was going to start, the national level. We will never solve homelessness locally. We can mitigate it. I believe we will reduce it. I've built 2,000 beds of shelters in the last 18 months, more than any city in the country. We have 8,000 between our hotel beds, new apartments that we're buying, hotels and motels that we're buying and converting. We're going to have more in the next 18 months than we've seen in the last 30 years. But I still think we're going to have a ton of encampments when we're done. The only thing that will end it is a right to housing. Every country I've ever studied that doesn't have homeless folks gives a right to housing, and then can mandate that people move into that housing. Here, the courts say you can't tell people to take down a tent or move them, rightfully so, if you don't have a place for them to go, because you're just moving them from place to place. And the city can clean up, and we do need to clean up sidewalks every so often, things like that, and that can always be controversial. We can arrest people, but you shouldn't arrest people for being homeless, though if there's serious crime, that has to be dealt with on the streets. But arresting people and cleaning people is not a solution to homelessness. A right to housing is. So last part I'll tell you, so you can picture this. We don't believe hunger should exist in America. So we have food stamps. And if you're poor and you qualify, 100% of people who qualify for food stamps get them. We don't think that people should have no health care. So if you're poor in America, you get Medi-Cal, that's what we call it here, it's Medicaid nationally, to make sure that you have basic medical care. But when it comes to housing, our biggest program, something called Section 8, which is a voucher to go into finding housing, there's a 1 in 8 chance if you qualify, that you will get a Section 8 voucher in the city of Los Angeles. And there's a decade plus long waiting list. If we had a right to that, like we do a right to not go hungry and a right to not die from sickness, we would eliminate homelessness. And so I worked with Bernie Sanders and with Joe Biden to put into their platforms a universal entitlement to housing. And we got into both. And with Joe Biden on the ballot, it's one of the reasons I'm such a strong supporter of him, besides the friendship I have with him, besides the ways he helped LA raise its minimum wage and make community college free and worked on climate. I think that would be the single biggest thing, and maybe the only thing, if we truly want to end homelessness on the housing front. On the second side, we need a mental health program for this country. And without that, if 10 of us are addicted to meth and we go in saying we want to get clean, none of us will be seen. But if 10 of us went into emergency room with a broken leg, all 10 of us would be seen. We need that sort of, not stage 4 intervention, but immediate emergency intervention with mental health. And in the meantime, helping control rent. So we put a moratorium on evictions during this, so more people don't become homeless. We've expanded protections for renters in any legal way that the state allows us to do. And we put $103 million out to help people pay their rent in this pandemic, even though it's the worst economic year. So I know there's some who call for us to say rent vacation. Nobody has to pay rent. We would be broke in about 2 weeks as a city government if we did that, because we'd be on the hook for people's rents. But I think the federal government should pass a CARES package that in the short term prevents any more people from becoming homeless by helping give assistance to mortgage holders, those people that own the apartments, who then can pass on rent vacations to their tenants until we're done with COVID. And I've been very strong and outspoken on that. Sorry for the long answer, but homelessness is a big, big issue.
No, thank you for that answer. There was a few follow-up questions I was going to ask that you already covered, actually.
Okay.
But one question I did want to ask is in terms of rent. I know this is a big cause of homelessness.
Yep.
I know that there's some propositions on the ballot that, if enacted, would address the rent crisis. What are your thoughts on those?
So there's one that's Prop 21. It's not perfect, but I voted for it just I think 2 days ago. And by the way, everybody should know how to vote if you never voted by mail. This is the first time I've ever voted by mail. I always do it in person, but you can drop them off at any library, LA City Library. There's a drop box that's secure, or just put it in the mail. There are Prop 15 that I mentioned, which would help us with affordable housing because it would increase. A lot of people said it's going to make property taxes go up. I want to be very specific. It would allow those businesses that have been paying property taxes that are like 40, 50 years old to pay what businesses today have to pay. And it wouldn't raise residential property taxes at all. So that would give local government and schools a lot more money, and that could be put into affordable housing as well. Let's see what else is on the ballot. Measure J is a local county measure that I support that would put a higher percentage of the county funds into dealing with things like homelessness, human services, anti-poverty, structural racism, and not just into kind of public safety and other things. So those are the main ones that obviously the presidential election to me is all about housing for me personally. And the policies couldn't be more night and day. One other that's not housing per se, but Prop 16, I hope folks will vote for. There's been a ban on affirmative action in California since 1996. And this would get rid of that ban so that we could use race as a factor on contracts, on admissions. We saw how, UCLA had some years with only, a dozen African Americans and the entire campus admitted. It's like, to me, I'm very supportive of that. It doesn't guarantee anything. It just allows it to be a factor. And we've been prohibited from using race as a factor when America's systemic racism certainly has used race as a factor for centuries.
Definitely. And thank you for touching on that. The CSU Board of Trustees actually voted to support Proposition 16, which I'm very proud of. So that's a step in that direction there. And kind of on the same theme of education, I wanted to ask, how would you propose we provide better education for our youth in both public schools, in the LAUSD, and in universities?
Well, with public schools, I think we have woeful underfunding. Our ratios, we have sometimes counselors that have 1,000 students to take care of. How can they give, whether it's career counseling or whether it's college counseling or whether it's personal counseling, how can they give that advice? You've got schools with a nurse 1 day a week, and young people don't schedule when they're going to get sick. So you've got elementary school students that go untreated for 4 or 5 days. I think first it's to put those resources there. Second, I would say, is really update the curriculum and I think there's going to be a lot of lessons from this year with remote learning to bring the technology into the classroom. First of all, we have to erase internet inequality. It used to be called the digital divide. I like internet inequality better. And I'm working very hard to make sure there's so many people that don't have access to high-speed internet, and it makes those who are already poor fall further behind. But updating the curriculum, especially with a focus on STEM and the growth that we will see in jobs here in Los Angeles, for instance, transportation careers. So we're investing $120 billion from Measure M and all these new rail lines. We need people who are going to be the engineers, who are going to build those buses, electric buses and trains. We need people who can be the operators of those vehicles. And so we're building a school, public school in South LA that will be a transportation academy. And anybody can go to it, but it'll have a particular focus on kids that are in the foster care system, kids that are coming out of the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, or who have been formerly homeless, to give them those sorts of opportunities. So I think we have to be very intentional with education, of making sure we have a modern curriculum, we have enough resources, but that we also reach those who we've known for years, even decades, are the ones who get lost, who fall behind, and surge the opportunities for success to them. Because, I'm a foster parent, my wife and I are foster parents. We can see that, a child left neglected for the first 5, 10, 15 years of his or her life, we're doing all this work to try to repair that trauma, to try to figure out a way to heal them. And it's such amazing young people who I've had as foster children who have changed my life as much as I believe I've changed theirs. But without an education system that recognizes the needs, those are the ones who often hit the streets and go to the jails and carry their trauma into things where now when they're 25, suddenly we're like, why are you a menace to society when we didn't do anything to help them when they were 15? At the university setting, I would say the same. I mean, it's been great to see the capital investments coming to the CSUs, to our community colleges for sure, of building out. And now I think it's really about building the human infrastructure to match that and to really match that up so that your college experience isn't just about what you learn in the classroom. One of the things that I've expanded is our Hire LA's youth program. This is for 16 to 24-year-olds to get great internships paid in careers you're interested in, not just say, hey, there's a job over here working in the sanitation department when you really want to work in movies, or vice versa, but things that match with who you are. We've expanded this from 5,000 to 20,000 plus a year. So we're going to be doing that ongoing. Go to HireLA'sYouth.org and check it out. Or I think that's the web address. I'll put it in the chat to make sure. And I put, by the way, our Green New Deal address in the chat too, at plan.lamayor.org. But I think that the classroom education is really critical, but so too is the vocational and professional opportunities you have simultaneously.
Yeah, and as a student, that's really exciting to hear. So thank you so much for sharing that with us as well. As a follow-up question, I wanted to ask, do you think COVID-19 is seriously going to impact the progress that has been made in education, or is going to harm it in terms of funding that it could have potentially gotten?
I do think there's going to be harm that comes out of this. And, Cal State Northridge produces more teachers than any other university into LAUSD. And we have such amazing teachers, and so many of them graduate as matadors. I hope that we can collectively, though, find a way to get back into the classroom safely, protect those teachers who are at high risk. But we have, for instance, had young people in our recreation centers, and our rec center workers have been working with them 8 hours a day, remote safe places if their parents work, they don't have the money for childcare. And we've shown without any outbreaks that you can do that safely, especially for the younger kids. I think once you get to high school, kids don't follow directions as much. Those can be super spreader events, and it's still very dangerous with COVID. But we should be trying to do everything we can to make sure our K through 5 students aren't falling behind. Because you think about it, you talk to a 5 or 6 year old, somebody who's in pre-K or kindergarten, this is like 20% of their life is COVID. That's like the equivalent for you guys of a couple years or a few years. For me, it'd be the equivalent of like five years. That's a huge, huge chunk of life for them. And we have to remember that they don't remember, many of them, life before COVID-19. And I'm worried that they're slipping behind. We need to get much better broadband everywhere. We need to make sure that we get the testing that they need so the schools can get open, even before we have, I think, a final vaccine. And finally, we need to be prepared for afterwards to catch up. And if that means even repeating some of the instruction, I think it's better for us not to just push a generation of COVID kids forward unformed, unlearning, and slipping further behind. That would be a secondary crime.
Thank you for addressing that. And this is kind of a trick question because nobody really knows, but when would you say we will be returning back to classrooms? Your best estimated guess, or as far as things are going now, what would you say?
I think we've had some, for labs and things, we've had some students in classrooms and critical professions where you can't do it remotely at community colleges safely. We've had for high need youth now the ability to go to school, whether it's English learners or folks with learning disabilities that they have to, have alternative learning plans for. And we've seen, as I said, the ability to do that at our rec centers. So I believe that you could do something now, but the bigger the institution, the more challenging that is. So I don't want to be naive that, hey, the mayor said it's easy, let's open up CSUN. It's a huge campus, it's complicated. The moment you have spread is the moment to shut things down. But as having the number of commuters that you have to CSUN, I think you'd be in a better place to open up earlier than others. But that's always going to be a collective decision, I think, probably of the CSUs. My best guess would be that if we get an approved vaccine and begin to distribute that and people actually step up, and that's a big if. A lot of people are saying, I'm not going to take a vaccine. Even those that are pro-vaccine are saying, well, wait till it's safe. We need to make sure we trust in our national leaders, that the doctors say this is safe, and then we do need to make sure we have that or the therapeutic, drugs that can help deal with COVID-19, if not a vaccine. And then I think we'd be probably someplace around spring where you could see people coming back to the classroom. I don't think it'll be at the beginning of the year, given that that's still flu season and a bunch of other stuff. Everybody get your flu shot, please, please, please. Even if you don't usually, or you didn't last year, get your flu shot so we don't overwhelm our hospitals. But my best guess is probably not before kind of February, March-ish, and it could be as late as the summer session.
Thank you so much for touching on that. And I know that's a really complicated question and one you can't possibly answer super truthfully because nobody knows, but thank you for attempting.
Sure.
Another thing I wanted to touch on is kind of a little bit more about what your plan as the mayor is, right? And kind of your vision. What is your primary objective or main goal you have right now as mayor of Los Angeles? And what are your goals for the future for Los Angeles?
So if you'd asked me before COVID, I would say it was threefold. It was to improve city services, which had been decimated by the last recession. And I'm so proud to have restored it. Our streets are much smoother and we actually quantify that. Our trees are getting trimmed. The basic services, our libraries have improved, the hours, those basic things that you count on the city to do. Second was to try to spur economic growth. And we are doing that too. We're growing more quickly than California, and California was growing more quickly than the country. We're building more housing here, for instance, something you don't feel in rents right away, but over time you will. 25% of the state's housing, even though we're just 10% of the population, looking at ways of kind of confronting those pressing challenges from homelessness to traffic to housing and climate now. And the third thing was to build the city of the future. Like I said at the beginning, something you never get credit for, nor should you, worry about getting credit, but you do something that I tell my staff, don't worry about the criticisms of today or the headlines of tomorrow. Think about reading a history of LA 10 or 25 years from now. And what is it saying about what you did today? And to me, that's the thing that LA just kind of took our eye off the ball for too long. We weren't building any new public transportation. We weren't doing big and bold things with our airport or our port. We weren't looking at the strategic industries and how we get people of color into Hollywood or tech. And so building the city of the future is really what my third goal was. Now post-pandemic, or in the midst of the pandemic, I would say, I wish we were post, I would add one other wrinkle to that, which is it's to help the city survive. Leadership, for me, it is day to day. It's to literally save lives. We say save lives, but when we became the first big city to shut down in America, the first city to mandate masks, the first city to eradicate the race gap of African-American deaths, the first city to start doing free testing to asymptomatic people, the first big city to do, there's like 7 or 8 things that we were the first to do. I don't know what the numbers would have been had we not done those things, but I know they would have been higher. I know that in a very vulnerable and dense city, we are at the bottom of the list in a good way for deaths per capita. And we've never had a huge explosion where our hospitals were overwhelmed. We got the PPE because we have a guy who runs the port, which is the busiest port in the Americas that I get to be in charge of with him. And he knows all the lines of the supply lines and was able to get at 73 cents per mask, American made N95 masks that we're supplying to all the hospitals at cost. So, to me, it's really about survival right now, and then the economic survival. Get as many people to stay in their housing, get as many businesses still limping through this, so that when we do emerge, we can emerge more quickly. I studied pandemics at the beginning of this, when it was first coming, because I wanted to prepare my city for what was coming. And there was the case study of San Francisco versus LA, and San Francisco came out of its, hey, it's okay, you can take your masks off more quickly than LA did. And they suffered much longer. Whereas those cities that even with the short-term pain and what it did to the economy of really trying to clamp down on that was influenza, they were able to come back much more quickly. That's when LA surpassed San Francisco as the dominant town of California. So to me, my goal is to continue shooting for the stars and reimagining the city and building that out, to confront the toughest challenges of today, from homelessness to climate, et cetera, keep our city services going. But then I'd add on top of that just to help the city right now survive.
Definitely, and that's really important, especially with everything going on. We need to address COVID first before getting to all the super important stuff. So thank you so much for that.
Sure.
And out of all the amazing things you've talked about and you've done for Los Angeles, what would you say the thing is that you're the most proud of?
Most proud of Angelinos. I mean, I don't spend my days like, hey, I'm proud of what Eric Garcetti did. I'm so proud of Angelinos stepping up this year. I mean, you find the TikTok party in the Hollywood Hills, you find the person getting in a fight over masks, but 99% of people aren't doing stupid stuff, and they've stepped up and saved lives. I think the second thing I'm most proud of is when voters have stepped forward and said yes to really big things that cost money, and take time, like building homeless housing, figuring out the public transportation system. I'm really proud of bringing the Olympics, and we're bringing the Olympics to the San Fernando Valley. When I was a kid, the Olympics came, and it was something that united the city and showed our face to the world. It was a great excuse to get a lot of things built, reduce traffic, snap the smog that we had for so long. And going up in the valley, though, we had no events in the valley, so we're going to be in the Sepulveda Basin. I can't wait for you in 2028, and I'll just be a father, taking my daughter, like my parents did me, to the first Paralympics we've ever had and the third Olympics. I think that'll be amazing. And then the last thing I'd say is I'm really proud of the way we've led on trying things here first, whether it's on racial justice and the mental health stuff that I was telling you about that we're going to roll out, whether it's taking the risk and saying we'll close down gas plants. I mean, it would be very easy to wait for other cities to go first, but I've tried to put a culture in of let's try being first, because we can be the architects of change. We can be the leaders to inspire others. And I think over the last 7 years, we've really done that in Los Angeles. And so that's maybe the one thing that I'm more selfishly proud of. But that culture didn't come from me. I think it came from a city that always wants to try new things.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And the Olympics is a really exciting thing. When I first heard about it, I was like, wow, Los Angeles. Okay, we're on the map. So,
and you guys could compete. You're young enough that you could pick up a sport still, and you got 8 years, so do it.
There we go. All this extra free time being at home, so
Yeah,
might
right.
as well, right? One of the last questions I'll ask is how do you recommend, well, let me start by saying we all have a really important election ahead of us. Whatever side you're on, this is going to be one of the most influential elections of our lifetimes. So how do you recommend we empower young people to vote? And I know the voter registration deadline was yesterday.
Yep.
But regardless, how do you recommend we empower young people to vote? And why is it so important to vote in this upcoming election more than ever before?
Well, if you haven't heard it yet, you'll hear it throughout your lives where elected officials like myself will say, or candidates will say, this is the most important election of your life. And I think they mean it from their heart, but they're usually on the ballot. So it's kind of self-serving. I'm not on the ballot. So I'm going to say with full credibility, with the years that I've lived in this city and in this country and on this earth, this literally is the most important election of our lives. I hope it's the most important till the day we die, that we never have a moment like this. But everything that's on the ballot, from what we do in terms of our leadership with climate change, our economy, and whether we decide to finally make it fairer, racial justice, and whether we say this was just a moment or whether this was truly a movement to birth a true multiracial democracy in our country, or whether it's the most selfish things. Will you be able to afford living in Los Angeles? Will you find a place to be able to find affordable housing? Will there be the jobs here? This election matters so much. But my second point is don't just fixate on the election. Elections are every 2 years or every 4 years. But the French philosopher Ernst Renan once wrote, "The nation is a daily plebiscite." In other words, we're called every single day to affirm and to work hard at making our nation more perfect, to participate. If you want to say you are a part of this nation, there's certain things you don't like about America right now, you can't just run away from America. Some people can, but that's a very luxurious thing to be able to do. That's a very privileged thing to be able to do. We don't have a choice but to stay here and fix what we don't like and to embrace and amplify what we do love. And one of the ways we can do that is when we vote. Other ways we can do that is by organizing. And I was so proud of people when we were marching on the streets this year for racial justice, but know that there's a second step to that. Learn how to cross from the street and come indoors and engage. And yes, not a dirty word, compromise, get as much as you can, get material benefits, move them forward, and then come back for more. The great struggles of this country were not magical moments where somebody brought a magic wand and said, okay, now it's all over. Slavery didn't end as we learn it because Abraham Lincoln said, okay, I'm going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. That was the result of slaves who fought for their freedom and died, abolitionists who stepped up and said this was wrong. Women didn't suddenly get the right to vote. You had to go state by state by state and long term. And don't be frustrated by the length and the pain it sometimes takes to put those paragraphs of American history down in the chapters of America's history book. Get engaged in ways of doing that every day and lead with love. If I could impress one thing, look, I'm the mayor and I receive unwarranted praise with people who don't know me. It's very nice of them. And I get a whole bunch of unwarranted attacks and insults. Somebody asked me what it's like to be mayor. And I shared the story a couple months ago where I was in a taco place and a young woman came up with her camera and she was on Instagram Live. She's like, "Are you Mayor Garcetti?" I said, "Yes." She's like, "What are you doing about homelessness?" And I started describing all the things we said. She's like, "I'm not, when are you up for election?" I'm like, "I'm not up for election again." She's like, "Well, good. I'd never vote for you. I hate you. You're the worst." Like streaming this live. I'm like, just picking up tacos with my wife. And then later that day, I was at a school doing some work with a school and a woman pulled up with her car next to me and rolled down the window and said, you're Mayor Garcetti? And again, I don't know, is this going to be incoming insult or something else? She's like, "I just want you to know that my family and I pray for you every single day and your family. And we thank you for what you do." And I got to say, it's okay for us to disagree, even vociferously, but let's not dehumanize each other. Let's not dehumanize me as a mayor. Let's not me dehumanize you as a student. Let's not dehumanize somebody because of the color of their skin or the profession that they've chosen. Let's find common ground and always lead with love, even as we're trying to convince people, because there is so much division and so much anger. We've seen from our national leaders, that is the model. And if we just copy it with our set of ideology, we're not moving the city forward. Don't compromise your values, but learn how to engage. And to me, that's as valuable as voting.
Of course, and I couldn't agree more. Compromise is so important, especially when our country is as divided as it is. So thank you so much for touching on that. Yep. We have 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to very quickly give you the platform to say anything else you think I missed or any other last things that you'd like the audience to know.
Well, Sahara, thank you for saying all the questions. And I know some folks typed some in, and I know some folks would have loved to say them. And my apologies that I didn't get to see more of your actual faces, but I appreciate you letting me into your rooms today and engaging with this conversation. Look, I'm your mayor. I have more job security and less job security than anybody I know. I'm your mayor until December 10th, 2022, and then I've got to move on. It has been the honor of my life to serve in local government. It's been the hardest work I could ever imagine. You make huge sacrifices, especially in the public eye. But I also know that long after the stress of this moment and this year for all of us, or even for this job for me, I will look back and I will define myself not as the mayor. It was funny, my daughter who's 8, one of her friends came up at school and we were still going to school and said, "You're the mayor, aren't you?" And I said, "No, my job is mayor, but I'm Maya's daddy." And we have to define ourselves by who we are. Long after you'll always be a matador, but long after you're a CSUN student, long after the job that you have, don't define yourself by the titles, whether it's as an elected representative in student government, whether it's the head of a club, whether it's as an athlete or something. Define yourselves by what you do and who you know and how you impact the people around you. We're only left with those two things. At the end of our days, a billionaire and a president, faced the same reckoning as somebody who's a pauper and who was a janitor. How good a life did you lead is based on the relationships that you had and the hard work you put into them, the way you brought love to as many moments as you could. And then second, what you left behind. What did you do with your time on earth? It doesn't matter who's looking. It doesn't matter the credit. It doesn't matter what's next and new. Think about what makes you happy. And they show these studies over time when people die. You know, the thing that makes people the happiest is not material wealth. It's not the prestige that they get. It's two things. It's the relationships they had, but even above that, it's the difference that they made. So go make a difference. And don't worry who's looking. Don't worry about what they say. I mean, listen to people, be humble, but always lead with your heart and know that your happiness will come from what you will give to others, not what you find for yourself.
Wow, that's really amazing. Thank you once again so much for sharing that with us. And also thank you so much for being here today, for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak to us at CSUN. I really appreciate it. And good luck with everything going forward.
Thank you. And feel free to call on me if you want to do it next term or something. I'm always here as your mayor. And call our office if you ever need help. Call 311 directly or go to lamayor.org. Be well, be strong, be safe. Strength and love to everybody.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.